Hello guys, you might remember that I recently started to build this B-Type Military Omnibus from Miniart, which is the military version of their London bus. In that previous video I built up the kit, I looked at the different paint schemes including troop transport and medical corps schemes, and we ended up with the kit looking something like this. After looking at some reference photos, I decided to do my bus as a medical transport vehicle, an ambulance, and I showed you some 3D files that I downloaded to 3D print some figures to support that. In this video I'm going to be painting and weathering the vehicle ready for the diorama. Choosing the correct colour for World War I vehicles like these is notoriously difficult. Service colour or service brown is often quoted as the correct colour, but if we look at some reference photos there's a clear difference between the colours on the lower side and the upper side. So I wasn't super bothered about getting the exact right shade. Initially I tried Tamiya XF51 dark green, but that's not quite the shade that I wanted. It's a little bit too green, maybe not quite brown enough. So I then added to the mixture some XF49 khaki and some XF61, which is khaki drab. I don't remember the exact ratio to be honest, but this is how things came out. A much more sort of yellow-brown colour. As this is a repainted London bus, I wasn't sure where to apply the colour, particularly on the interior, but ultimately I gave the interior the same colour as the exterior, with everything being over a grey base coat and then NATO black panel line shading. However, to break things up, I did give the floors a coat of a XF64 red-brown colour. Next up I airbrushed on VMS gloss varnish, only in the areas where the decals would go. This is a scheme I went for, which is 93 Company Army Service Corps, used as an ambulance on the Somme, autumn 1916. With a gloss coat of VMS varnish under them, the decals went down well, and some Tamiya mark fit over the top to encourage them. I did notice they're slightly too large for the panels here, so they're slightly overlapping at the top. Of course, if that had been a major problem, I could have just painted these on by hand because they are intended to be hand-painted markings here. Next up was the detail painting. The tyres were given a coat of a light grey rubber colour from AK. I find a great way to do this is to put the wheel on a cocktail stick or a cut off piece of sprue, hold the paintbrush fairly still and simply rotate the wheel. The metal parts of the tools were given a coat of Vallejo metal colour, steel. I really do like these metal colours. They airbrush straight out of the bottle, but they also brush straight out of the bottle as well, surprisingly. I've used them a lot recently, and although they're expensive, they are worth it, in my opinion. I also had to mask and airbrush that white stripe across the bonnet or the hood, plus a few bits of detail on the driver's controls. This kit is incredibly fragile with so many pieces you can break off while you're handling it. In fact, at this point I glued the wheels on so that I could have something solid to hold on to. This piece here is supposed to be brass. This is MIG's brass colour, which it's quite hard I find to both brush and airbrush, but an upside of that is if you put it on over a green coat like here, it does give the impression of worn and faded brass. Here's our ambulance minus the top deck on the diorama base. I think it looks pretty decent at this stage. I did want to paint the wooden planks in the driver's compartment, plus the individual planks in the lower deck and the upper deck. To do that I used Vallejo model colour. This is a single brown colour that I took, and to get the variation of tone I simply applied the paint with more or less water. So I've got this in a palette here, and I'm simply drying my brush more or less to change the mix that I apply to the model. And you can see I've done the same thing down here with the lower deck. To reveal the number of the bus, rather than painting the photo etch, I simply scrape the paint away with a toothpick to reveal the metal below. That gives a much neater and more accurate appearance than trying to paint those digits. I tried to give a bit of a sort of chipping and wood grain effect to the wooden boxes which go in the front and the back of the bus. This was done with a light beige colour paint and a fine brush. The effect is a little bit overdone, but I think it still gives the impression of damage to that box and stops it looking like a perfect factory fresh box. Talking of wooden areas, the bus has wooden planks over the windows. I painted each of these planks a slightly different shade of a beigey brown colour, then tried to add some similar chipping and scuffing effects using the same light beige paint. However, as it happened, while I was making this model, I also built these wooden gangplanks for my LCM diorama, and I felt these looked much better than the wooden effects on the Miniart parts. So with that in mind, I took 4 coffee stirrers, gave them a coat of matte black directly onto the wood, then a coat of XF55 deck tan over the top of that, varying the opacity so some of the black still showed through. Then I used Vallejo model colours, browns and tan colours, thinned to various degrees with water applied over the top. Typically here I applied the paint in the middle or at one end and tried to spread it all the way down the plank, and that gave a subtle colour change throughout the length of the single plank. I was really pleased with the way they came out, and I think if we compare them here with the kit parts, although they are a bit thicker, they do look a lot better in terms of appearance and colour. Next I wanted to give some chipping and wear and tear effects to the seats on the top deck and the benches on the lower deck. In order to do that, I used this chipping and scratching agent from Humbrol. Each of the pieces was given a bottom coat of XF55, which is a light deck tan colour, a coat of the chipping and scratching fluid, and then a coat of Tamiya XF64. This is the hairspray technique, so by wetting the top layer of paint and letting that water soak through, we can activate that chipping fluid, and the top coat of the paint will flake away to reveal the light colour below. You can use various tools to do this. I found a toothpick to be most useful. The only thing I wanted to be careful of here, and I found that maybe this chipping fluid wasn't quite as effective as hairspray in this regard, is that I wanted to avoid large chips. I wanted lots of quite small, quite fine scratches and chips, but that wasn't always possible. I tried to concentrate the damage on the aisle side of the seat, as I figured that's where most people will be passing. That would get the most use compared to the outside area of the seats away from the aisle. The chipping technique didn't work super well on the bottom surface of the seats, and I was really only able to get the effect on the very edge there, as you can see. I did use the same technique on the wooden benches for the lower deck. I struggled a bit more with these, I think mainly because I couldn't quite work out in my head where the wear and tear would appear and which direction it would go in. Would it go in parallel or perpendicular to the long edge of the seats there? Again, I tried to concentrate that wear on the edge of the seats, but I wasn't as happy with this as I was with the seats for the upper deck. Luckily, of course, they'll be quite well hidden inside that lower deck. Here you can see what those seats will look like, just placed, dry fitted, onto the upper deck. Next up was a pin wash with sepia oil paint from Abteilung 502. Thinned with odourless thinner, this was applied to basically everything in the bus. So here I'm applying it to the seats to try to highlight the detail there in that grooved seat, and shadow areas around the joinery. In a situation like this, I'm not so worried if there's excess paint because it blends quite nicely into the surrounding paintwork and just looks like dirt and grime. Equally, the slats and the panel lines on the top deck of the bus were just asking for a pin wash. Again, I went quite heavy on this because I expect this to be quite a dirty, well-used vehicle. There's also a lot of detail on the exterior of the bus that would take a pin wash well, from these large and very prominent panel lines on the front to small bolt head detail in many places. The wheels are also just crying out for a wash, with all that recessed detail and raised detail. I feel like that pin wash really brings them alive there. I then took a very light olive drab colour, much lighter than the base coat, and applied very small amounts of it to all of the bolt heads, rivet heads, and other raised detail. This was to try to make those details more prominent and act as a kind of artificial highlight. I think you can see there those bolts on the wheel just stand out so much more once that's been done. I figured that if the seats themselves were quite heavily chipped and damaged and scuffed, the floor would need to be too. Here I went for a sponge chipping effect, again with a light beigey old wood colour. This didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to, but still I think it does have the effect of looking like scuffed edges on those wooden slats. It was then time to fix the wooden panels. And finally I felt that the paintwork of the bus was still a bit monotone, it was still a bit too perfect, especially given the wear and tear on the other areas of the bus. So one technique I found really useful for breaking up these single colour paint jobs is to do some oil paint speckling. This is my sepia oil paint again, really heavily thinned and speckled basically all over the surface of the bus, just by flicking a paintbrush against a piece of sprue. The effect that has is quite subtle, so you might not be able to see it there on the camera, but by adding very faint patches of brown sepia paint all over the paintwork, it just breaks up that pattern. It looks like maybe slightly dirty paint or slightly faded paint or older paint. It just breaks up that single solid colour a bit. After 24 hours for the oil paint to dry, we're ready to look at the progress so far. And there we go guys, that is my progress so far on the Miniart Omnibus. I had hoped in this video to have everything ready for you and have the diorama finished with the figures, but I've been so busy recently that that's just not happened. So I thought rather than make you wait for a few more weeks, I'll get this video out and you can see my progress so far. I hope you enjoyed this video. I want to say thank you to all of you for watching. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members who have seen lots of work in progress photos of this kit. I will be back soon with another video, and until then, thank you for watching and have fun modelling.